Have you ever wondered when humans first looked beyond what their eyes could see? Long before temples, priests, or sacred texts, there was awe, raw, unfiltered, and born from survival. Imagine standing under an ancient African sky, 1.8 million years ago. You are Homo erectus, fragile before roaring storms, trembling as night falls, surrounded by sounds you cannot name. Every flash of lightning, every shadow that moved in the darkness, whispered of something greater, something invisible, powerful, and unpredictable. In those moments, faith wasn't a doctrine. It was instinct, a silent plea to the unseen when fear overwhelmed reason. Our ancestors didn't believe in gods as we do. They felt forces, wind, thunder, death, and tried to make sense of them. When a loved one died and never returned, perhaps they thought, where did their breath go? That question, simple yet profound, was the spark of spirituality. It was not about worship, but about seeking protection from storms, predators, and the unknown itself. And so, the invisible began to take shape in the human mind. A rustle in the grass wasn't just an animal, it could be a spirit. A lucky hunt wasn't chance, it was a sign. Slowly, patterns of meaning began to form in the chaos of existence. These early humans didn't separate the natural from the supernatural. Both were part of one living reality. When they gathered around the fire, sharing stories of mysterious lights or the echoing calls of unseen beings, they were already building the foundations of faith. This wasn't religion as we know it, it was survival psychology. Yet within that survival lay the first spark of something eternal, the belief that life had more to it than what was visible. Faith became a companion in fear, a way to make the unknown less terrifying, and perhaps to give life purpose amid uncertainty. That invisible trust, that yearning for connection with something beyond the senses, still lives in us. The first flicker of faith was born not in temples, but in trembling hearts facing the dark. If this glimpse into our distant spiritual past fascinated you, hit like, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter in this journey through the origins of human faith. As the flames crackled and shadows danced on the cave walls, our ancestors began to sense that they weren't alone. The night carried voices, rustling leaves, distant howls, thunder rolling across the plains. Each sound had meaning. Each movement held a presence. For early humans, the world was alive with unseen forces, and survival depended on understanding, or at least appeasing them. Fear was not just a reaction, it was a teacher. It sharpened their instincts and sculpted their beliefs. Imagine a group of Homo erectus seeking shelter from a sudden storm. The wind howls, lightning splits the sky, and the earth trembles. To them, this wasn't random weather. It was something expressing power, something that demanded respect. In the face of such mystery, fear became reverence, and reverence slowly transformed into faith. From this emotional soil, the seeds of spirituality took root. These early people began to link cause and effect through invisible intentions. If a child fell ill after someone's anger, perhaps emotions carried power. If a hunt failed after ignoring a ritual gesture, maybe the unseen world was displeased. Slowly, their minds connected inner feelings with outer events, creating a bridge between the physical and the spiritual. This connection changed everything. The world was no longer a collection of objects, it was a conversation. The wind could warn, the river could bless, the fire could punish. Life itself became a dialogue with forces that could not be seen, but could be felt. In this silent exchange, humanity began its long journey toward meaning. Faith, then, was born not from certainty, but from uncertainty. It emerged where knowledge ended and imagination began. And that fragile, Balance between fear and wonder, between the visible and the invisible, became the foundation of what we now call belief. As the flames crackled and shadows danced on the cave walls, our ancestors began to sense that they weren't alone. The night carried voices, rustling leaves, distant howls, thunder rolling across the plains. Each sound had meaning, each movement held a presence. For early humans, the world was alive with unseen forces, and survival depended on understanding, or at least, appeasing them. Fear was not just a reaction, it was a teacher. It sharpened their instincts and sculpted their beliefs. Imagine a group of Homo erectus seeking shelter from a sudden storm. The wind howls, lightning splits the sky, and the earth trembles. To them, this wasn't random weather. It was something expressing power, something that demanded respect. In the face of such mystery, fear became reverence, and reverence slowly transformed into faith. From this emotional soil, the seeds of spirituality took root. These early people began to link cause and effect through invisible intentions. If a child fell ill after someone's anger, perhaps emotions carried power. If a hunt failed after ignoring a ritual gesture, maybe the unseen world was displeased. Slowly, their minds connected inner feelings with outer events, creating a bridge between the physical and the spiritual. This connection changed everything. The world was no longer a collection of objects. It was a conversation. The wind could warn, the river could bless, the fire could punish. Life itself became a dialogue with forces that could not be seen but could be felt. In this silent exchange, humanity began its long journey toward meaning. Faith, then, was born not from certainty, but from uncertainty. It emerged where knowledge ended and imagination began. And that fragile balance between fear and wonder, between the visible and the invisible, became the foundation of what we now call belief. When the flames dimmed and silence returned, another kind of mystery awaited: death. For early humans, nothing was more incomprehensible. One moment, a companion breathed and moved. The next, the spark was gone. What had vanished? Where had it gone? That question haunted the species long before language could even express it. At first, perhaps, they simply watched. The body cooled, the eyes no longer followed light. And yet, it still looked like the person they knew. Something invisible had left. The breath, the movement, the presence. This absence was not just loss, it was a revelation. It hinted at a world beyond the visible, one that existed just out of reach. In time, fear and love intertwined. They could not abandon the dead. Some covered them with stones, others placed tools or flowers beside them. These gestures weren't practical. They were symbolic. The act of burial was the first acknowledgement that life might continue somewhere else. Death, instead of being an end, became a threshold. That threshold was terrifying. If the dead could somehow exist elsewhere, they might also return. The invisible world was now populated not just by forces of nature, but by the spirits of those once known. This changed how humans behaved. Fire no longer protected only against beasts. It guarded against unseen presences. Silence wasn't just emptiness. It was listening. Each burial, each offering, deepened the story. Through death, the human mind constructed the idea of continuity, the earliest version of eternity. The body remained on Earth, but the essence, whatever it was, escaped into another realm. The supernatural was born not from fantasy, but from grief and longing. And so the concept of faith evolved once more. It became not only about fear or survival, but about connection, an invisible thread that linked the living to the unseen world of ancestors. In every mound of earth that covered a body, humanity buried not just a person, but a question that still echoes through time. What happens after we close our eyes for the last time. What do you think our ancestors felt when they first faced death? Leave your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear your interpretation of this ancient mystery. When words did not yet exist, rhythm spoke. Long before chants or prayers, the first humans discovered that sound could move something inside them, something invisible, emotional, and sacred. A heartbeat echoed in the chest, hands struck against stone, feet pounded the ground. The rhythm matched the pulse of life itself. Through movement and sound, humanity found its earliest spiritual expression. Imagine a group gathered at dusk, the fire flickering as the air fills with beats and breath. There are no instruments as we know them, only bones, sticks, stones, and bodies that sway in unity. These weren't mere celebrations, they were acts of connection, attempts to touch the unseen through vibration and motion. Each stomp of the foot was both a declaration of life and an offering to what lay beyond. As groups grew larger, rhythm became language. The repetition of movement created a trance, dissolving the line between self and others. In that collective rhythm, early humans may have felt they were no longer alone. Something greater moved with them, an unseen presence woven into every breath, every beat. Over time, these moments evolved into structure. Certain dances might have been reserved for hunts, others for mourning or healing. The sound became sacred not because of what it was, but because of what it did. It altered the mind. It allowed them to glimpse a world where spirit and matter intertwined. This primal communication shaped the foundation of later religious ritual. Before prayers had words, they had rhythm. Before symbols were carved, they were danced. The body was the first temple, the drum the first voice of creation. Through sound and movement, our ancestors gave form to emotions they couldn't explain and reached for truths beyond comprehension. Faith, once born from fear and loss, now found joy and energy in expression. The invisible was no longer only terrifying. It was something to be celebrated, invoked, and felt through every fiber of the human form. Somewhere deep within a cave, a hand pressed against the wall and left its mark. A print of ash and ochre, fragile yet eternal. That gesture, simple, human, was more than decoration. It was a statement. I was here. But perhaps it also meant something more. Maybe it was a plea to the unseen, a message meant not for other humans, but for something watching from the shadows. As humanity's inner world grew richer, so did its expression. The first symbols carved into stone were not language as we understand it. They were emotion turned into form. Circles, spirals, animal figures, they all carried layers of meaning lost to us now. To the ancient mind, these shapes were alive. They were not merely drawings, they were connections between the tangible and the mystical. Every stroke of pigment, every carved line, represented an effort to anchor the invisible. The cave became both shelter and shrine. The walls weren't blank surfaces, they were thresholds. What we call art today may once have been invocation, a way to summon protection or communicate gratitude to forces unseen. In the flickering firelight, these images came alive. The painted beasts moved, their shadows merging with the rock. To those watching, it must have felt as though the walls themselves breathed. This was no coincidence. It was ritual theater, a communion between artist and spirit, between flesh and stone. Through these acts, humans began to externalize belief. The invisible world took form through pigment and pattern, turning imagination into reality. The mind that once trembled before storms now created universes with its hands. Every carved mark was a bridge, a connection between the finite and the infinite. Even when survival was harsh, humans continued to paint. That persistence tells us something profound. Faith was no longer only about fear, it had become creation itself. Through symbols, humanity learned to dream not just of survival, but of meaning. As human imagination expanded, some individuals began to see more than others. They were the dreamers, the ones who wandered beyond the boundaries of ordinary perception. In every ancient group there was someone who seemed to feel the invisible more intensely: the healer, the seer, the interpreter of signs. Thus emerged the first shamans, the earliest bridge between the human and the divine. To the tribe, the shaman was both feared and revered. They walked a delicate line between madness and wisdom. When storms struck or illness spread, it was the shaman who entered the firelight, painted in ash and blood, chanting to unseen forces. Their rhythm echoed the heartbeat of the earth. Their breath carried whispers to the spirits. Through trance, dance, and pain, they crossed the threshold others could not. These journeys weren't symbolic. They were real experiences of altered consciousness. The shaman's mind became the first sacred space. Guided by rhythm, smoke, and vision, they traveled inward to meet what the tribe called the beyond. Their stories of flying over mountains, speaking with ancestors, or bargaining with spirits were not lies. They were expressions of humanity's growing awareness of the inner world as a gateway to the infinite. This figure became essential to early society. The shaman didn't just heal bodies, they restored balance between worlds. They carried the burden of both fear and hope, interpreting dreams, guiding rituals, and ensuring the tribe's harmony with unseen powers. In their voice, the invisible world gained a messenger. The shaman's existence marked a turning point. Faith was no longer a collective instinct. It now had intermediaries, those who could interpret the sacred and bring its power to the living. Through them, the concept of spiritual authority was born, a seed that would later grow into priesthoods and religious hierarchies. If you lived in those ancient times, would you trust the shaman's visions? Tell me in the comments, how do you think these early spiritual guides shaped the way we see faith today? As humanity spread across vast landscapes, survival demanded more than strength. It required trust. Small groups could no longer thrive through instinct alone. They needed shared purpose, shared meaning. And that meaning often came through faith. Belief in unseen forces became the invisible glue that held early communities together. When individuals shared rituals, songs, and symbols, they also shared emotion. Around the fire, the repetition of sacred gestures created belonging. It wasn't just about pleasing spirits, it was about affirming, we are one. This unity transformed scattered bands into tribes and tribes into cultures. The same invisible faith that once comforted a lone hunter now bound dozens of hearts to a common story. Faith offered a structure for cooperation. It explained why sharing food was sacred, why breaking trust invited danger, why honesty and generosity mattered. Moral codes didn't appear out of nowhere, they grew from belief. If unseen powers watched and judged, then every action had weight. The divine became the first form of social control, a moral compass that preceded law. This shift changed human destiny. The spiritual world became not just personal, but political. Rituals became agreements, ceremonies became contracts, and myths became the foundations of identity. Those who led rituals were not only spiritual figures, they were the architects of social harmony. Even conflict took on a sacred tone. To defend one's group wasn't merely survival, it was duty. Faith turned blood ties into spiritual kinship, binding people who weren't related by birth but by belief. This emotional network allowed humans to cooperate at scales never seen before, paving the way for complex societies. And so, through shared reverence, humanity began to transcend the limits of biology. The unseen gave meaning to the visible. The spiritual sustained the social. What began as trembling fear beneath the stars had evolved into the most powerful tool of civilization, collective faith. As human societies grew more complex, so did their understanding of the unseen. What began as scattered spirits of wind and river slowly merged into grander forces, entities with names, faces, and stories. The invisible became personal. The storm was no longer just a spirit's anger, it was the will of a god. This transformation didn't happen overnight. For generations, humans told stories to explain the mysteries that surrounded them. Each story carried fragments of memory, of thunder, of birth, of death, and shaped them into patterns. Over time, those patterns solidified into myth. The myths gave the cosmos structure. They explained why the sun rose, why rain fell, why suffering existed. Through myth, humanity gave the universe a voice. As society stabilized through agriculture and settlement, the divine grew closer to human form. Gods began to resemble their worshippers, strong, wise, jealous, loving. These reflections of human emotion gave people a sense of connection, of being seen and understood by higher powers. Faith evolved from instinct to relationship. Temples replaced caves, priests replaced shamans. Yet the essence remained, the yearning to understand, to negotiate with forces beyond comprehension. Sacrifices were offered not only to seek favor, but to maintain balance. The old belief that everything was alive persisted, now refined into systems of worship that governed daily life. This new divine order also brought hierarchy. The gods mirrored human society, and power became sacred. Kings ruled by divine right, wars were fought in the name of heaven, and morality became law under the watchful eyes of unseen judges. Faith was no longer a personal survival mechanism, it had become civilization's foundation. Still, behind all this structure, the ancient whisper remained. Beneath every temple's stone and every ritual's chant lived the same trembling awe that once filled the hearts of our ancestors by the fire. The gods were new, but the yearning was timeless. Humanity had simply given the mystery a name. If we look back across time, from our modern temples to the flickering fires of ancient plains, one thread connects every human story: the search for meaning in the unseen. Faith has been our constant companion, evolving with us, from fear to reverence, from ritual to philosophy. And yet, its essence has never changed. It is the same pulse that once beat in the chest of Homo erectus, trembling beneath a storm, whispering to the shadows for protection. Over millions of years, faith became humanity's most powerful invention. It taught us to see beyond hunger and danger, to imagine, to hope, to dream. It inspired art on cave walls, the first songs, the first laws. Without that invisible belief, civilization itself might never have taken shape. Every step forward, from the shaman's trance to the philosopher's reflection, was built upon the same foundation: trust in something greater than ourselves. Even today, when science explains what once seemed divine, the mystery remains. We still look to the stars, still feel awe in silence, still ask why we are here. The faces of gods have changed, but the longing behind them has not. That ancient spark that once made our ancestors reach for the unseen still burns within us. It reminds us that we are not just observers of the world. We are participants in something vast and sacred. Faith, in its deepest form, is not about answers. It is about the courage to keep asking, to continue seeking connection when reason reaches its limit. And that courage, born 1.8 million years ago, still defines what it means to be human. If this journey through time inspired you, don't forget to like, this video, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments, the spark of faith still lives in us. It's amazing to think that from ancient firelight to glowing screens, the same human heart continues to seek the invisible. Watch our next video to explore how these early beliefs transformed into the first great civilizations. The story of faith is far from over. It's only just beginning.